29th of April 1945, Royal Palace of Caserta, Italy. In a chandelier-lit room that had seen Bourbon balls and wartime briefings, two German officers, Lieutenant Kommissar Victor von Schweinitz of Army Group C and SS Major Jürgen Wenner, placed their signatures on an instrument of surrender that would halt all German and Italian fascist forces still fighting in Italy. The document, accepted for the Allies by Lieutenant General Sir William Duthie Morgan, set a precise timer. Hostilities would cease at 12 noon on 2nd May. What looked like a clean, formal end had in fact been engineered by weeks of clandestine contacts between an American spy chief and a Nazi general who was quietly defying his own regime. The Americans called the back channel Operation Sunrise. Without it, the last days of the Italian campaign could have turned far bloodier and far longer. The war in northern Italy had reached its terminal phase. Allied air power had smashed bridges over the Po River. German columns were running out of fuel, ammunition, and ways to retreat. Inside Army Group C's headquarters, commanders knew their formations were disintegrating under the pressure of the Allied spring offensive and partisan uprisings across Lombardy and Veneto. Yet Hitler's orders and the fear of a stab-in-the-back legend pressed many to fight on to the last. What changed the equation was a figure few expected, SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff, Himmler's longtime aide, and by 1945, the top SS and police commander in Italy. Wolff began sounding out the Americans in neutral Switzerland about a local surrender, a move so dangerous that if exposed too soon it could have cost him his life. The American in Bern was Alan W. Dulles, head of the Office of Strategic Services in Switzerland. He had one non-negotiable condition: no separate peace, only unconditional surrender under Allied control. Meetings unfolded in safe houses around Bern and Zurich, with Swiss intermediaries shuttling messages and providing cover. Wolff wanted to avoid a partisan takeover in the north and hoped, at first, to extricate Army Group C into Austria to continue the war against the Soviets. Dulles refused, insisting the Germans lay down their arms to the Allied armies in Italy. The codename Sunrise fit the stakes. If the deal worked, the Italian front would stop fighting days, perhaps weeks, before Berlin's general capitulation, saving civilian lives and preventing scorched earth destruction across the Po Valley's factories, rail hubs, and power stations. News of the secret talks leaked eastward. Joseph Stalin suspected the West of cutting a side deal that would free German divisions to fight the Red Army. Blunt cables flew between Moscow, London, and Washington as Stalin demanded a Soviet seat at any negotiations. The controversy foreshadowed the mistrust that would soon define the Cold War, and it forced the Americans to thread a diplomatic needle, keep Sunrise alive, while proving they were not betraying the Allied pledge against a separate peace. In practice, that meant one thing: any agreement would culminate at an Allied table in Italy with a Soviet representative present, and it would be enforced by Allied commands, not private assurances. Behind the signatures at Caserta stood that entire clandestine architecture. The Italian theater's Allied commander, Field Marshal Alexander, had read the battlefield. German supply lines were shattered, divisions were exhausted, and partisan control of key nodes was spreading by the hour. The surrender terms reflected reality and hard bargaining, immediate obedience to Allied orders, no delaying maneuvers disguised as withdrawals, and a synchronized halt to fighting to reduce confusion and reprisals. To frame it as a single day, when a German general helped the Americans win, is to compress months of couriers, cover stories, and incremental concessions into one decisive moment. But the hinge was real. On 29th of April at Caserta, the secret channel turned into binding military orders, and a front that had consumed Allied lives since 1943 finally went dark. The clandestine phase began in February-March 1945 under the neutral roofs of Bern and Zurich. Wolff, calculating that the Reich was finished in Italy and that his own survival hinged on talking to the enemy, sent feelers through Swiss contacts to Dulles. Early sessions tested whether the Americans would entertain anything short of capitulation. They would not. Wolff floated a proposal to yield northern Italy to Allied occupation while sliding Army Group C across the Brenner into Austria to resist the Soviets. Dulles's answer, no evacuation, no redeployment, no half measures, was backed by the Casablanca formula of unconditional surrender. Sunrise would either deliver an orderly, complete laydown of arms in the Italian theatre, or it would fail. Inside the German chain of command, consent was not automatic. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was being moved to the Western Front. His successor in Italy, General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, initially balked at anything that could be construed as betrayal while Hitler lived. The Wehrmacht staff feared being scapegoated for premature capitulation. At the same time, reality gnawed. Fuel dumps were emptying, ammunition trains were scarce, and Allied air interdiction made the Po crossings lethal. The partisan tide, communists, Catholics, monarchists, was cresting in Turin, Milan, and Genoa. The more Wolff and Dulles talked, the clearer it grew to the Germans that there was no path to an organized withdrawal. They could end the fighting with terms, or watch the front disintegrate into chaos. Stalin's protests complicated everything. In March and April, he accused the Western Allies of plotting a separate peace. Churchill and Roosevelt, and then Truman, insisted otherwise. In London and Washington, messages emphasized that any Italian surrender would be formalized with Allied visibility and Soviet participation. The effect on Sunrise was paradoxical. It slowed the talks, but legitimized their endgame. By agreeing that the final act would not be a Swiss salon handshake, but a military instrument at Allied headquarters in Italy, the Americans reduced Soviet suspicion enough to proceed, while keeping the channel to Wolff open just long enough to matter. Meanwhile, the battlefield moved faster than the diplomats. In April, the Allies punched through the Gothic line, surged across Lombardy, and cracked remaining German defenses. Air forces severed rail lines and collapsed Po River bridges, trapping columns south of the crossings. Even senior German officers admitted by mid-April that further destruction would buy nothing. Agriculture, power, and transport in the north were at stake, and scorched earth orders would only deepen post-war misery. Partisan forces were already seizing city halls and garrisons. If there was to be an orderly surrender, it had to be immediate and theatre-wide. The Sunrise conduit, and Wolff's willingness to use it, gave the Allies their chance. The final alignment clicked into place in the last week of April. With Vietinghoff's authorization relayed through his emissary von Schweinitz, and Wolff represented by Major Wenner, the German side accepted the Allied instrument. The venue would be the Royal Palace at Caserta near Naples. The substance would be unconditional, and the effective hour would be set to allow orders to cascade through scattered, retreating units. It was a bureaucratic end to a clandestine beginning, but it made the guns fall silent. On 29th of April, the delegates took their seats at Caserta. Credentials were examined, powers were confirmed. For the Allies, Morgan signed on behalf of Alexander. For the Germans, von Schweinitz signed for Vietinghoff and Wenner for Wolff, and by extension for Marshal Rodolfo Graziani's Italian Social Republic troops under German command. The appendices fixed the armistice clock at noon, the 2nd May, to let orders ripple through a broken field army spread from the Ligurian coast to the Alps. A Soviet officer, General Alexei Kislenko, was present to witness the act, a nod to the diplomatic storm Sunrise had stirred. Those 72 hours mattered. In northern Italy, 1 million Axis troops, Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS and fascist units were fragmented by river lines and collapsing logistics. The Allied language left little room for creative interpretation. Lay down arms, obey Allied instructions, and cease demolitions. By 2nd May, organized resistance ended across the theatre. In Rome, Naples, and on the Ligurian coast, commanders who might have fought to gain time instead complied, and the casualty curve flattened in the campaign's last week. For the Americans who had battled up the peninsula since Salerno and Anzio, the end arrived not with a final set-piece offensive, but via a document made possible by a German general's quiet decision to talk. There were still ceremonies to stage. On 3rd May, General Mark Clark hosted a formal event at Allied headquarters, receiving the surrender of remaining Axis forces from Lieutenant General Fridolin von Senger und Ettelin, a veteran of the Italian theatre who now acted as Vietinghoff's representative. But the fighting had already stopped. The logic of Caserta had rippled outward, and the shooting war in Italy was done. On 8 May, VE Day, the broader German capitulation in Europe followed, but in the Italian theatre, the decisive turn had come a week earlier. The timing was not accidental. It was the product of Sunrise's channel and the willingness on both sides to act on it before the front dissolved entirely. The Americans counted the strategic dividends quickly. Ending the Italian campaign ahead of the Reich's general surrender freed up shipping, airfields, and intelligence assets. It spared key industrial sites in Lombardy and Piedmont from last-minute demolition and reduced the chances of mass reprisals in the Po Valley's cities. Perhaps most importantly, it prevented a messy vacuum in which rival partisan factions might have clashed over control of northern Italy's institutions while German units still roamed. Dulles' insistence that surrender be to Allied commands, not to any particular partisan bloc, reflected that calculus as much as any concern for German good faith. Yet the political costs were real. Stalin's suspicions did not vanish with a witness at Caserta. In Moscow, Sunrise became Exhibit A in a narrative that the West would cut side deals when convenient. That mistrust bled into cooperation at the San Francisco Conference founding the United Nations and into the first months of Truman's presidency. In that sense, the day a German general secretly helped the Americans win in Italy also marked one of the first days of the post-war diplomatic chill. What became of the main protagonists underscored the moral tangle of wartime pragmatism. Allen Dulles parlayed Byrne into the early Cold War, eventually becoming Director of Central Intelligence. Karl Wolff, who had been complicit in Nazi crimes before turning to Sunrise, was not prosecuted at Nuremberg. His wartime cooperation with the Americans and the Swiss complicated his legal exposure for years and later stained Dulles' reputation among critics who saw Sunrise as a bargain with a tainted man. Even so, the result in Italy is difficult to dispute. Fewer civilians dead, less infrastructure destroyed, and a front shut down days earlier than it might otherwise have been. The numbers tell part of the story. When the instrument of surrender's effective hour struck on 2nd of May, hundreds of thousands of Axis soldiers, often rounded to about 1 million in contemporary press summaries, ceased resistance in the theatre framed by the Alps and the Adriatic. In the Po Valley's towns, Allied convoys rolled past factories and power stations that demolition squads had been unable or unwilling to finish off. And while tensions with Moscow crackled in the telegraph lines, the American units who had blared at Monte Cassino, along the Gustav and Gothic lines, and up the Apennines, could finally lay down their own burdens in Italy. The Allied victory there had many fathers: British logistics, American air and armor, Italian partisans, and the grinding attrition of 2 years of campaigning. But the final act owed something unusual to a man in a black SS uniform who at the end chose to talk instead of burn. The legacy of Sunrise is therefore double-edged. As a military episode, it is straightforward. Secret contacts led by an American spy and a German general accelerated the end of fighting in Italy and reduced the cost of victory. As a moral and political episode, it is a case study in the compromises of war termination, how the desire to save lives and infrastructure can collide with the demand for justice and the need to keep alliances intact. What made 29 April at Caserta and 2nd May across northern Italy significant was not only what stopped artillery demolitions, executions, but what began a new, colder contest among former allies and a lingering debate about where prudence ends and complicity begins.